Hi everyone, it's Max, and today I am here with a recommendations video. I am going to be recommending some of my favorite urban fantasies. I feel like I rarely talk about urban fantasy. I don't read it a whole lot, but I have gathered 10 books series that I think are awesome urban fantasies that I think everyone should read. So I actually have 3 series by the same person, which I kind of like didn't even realize it when I was looking at my shelves and accumulating like urban fantasies, but here we are. And that's Sean and Maguire. First of all is the October Days series. This is quintessential, like mass market paperback, a bunch published that are like murder mysteries but supernatural, and these are fantastic. If you've been following me at all this year, you will have heard me talking about this series because I'm reading 1 book a month for the year of 2021 and part of 2022 until I catch up. And this is about a half-fae named October Day who 14 years before the start of this book is turned into a fish. And so when she wakes up 14 years in the future, her family has moved on and she is just trying to find her way. She becomes a private investigator, but when one of her only fae friends left dies, she tasks her with finding her murderer, and she is thrown back into this world. I love this series. I love Toby, I love Tybalt, I love all of the side characters, and it's just so good, and I just highly suggest it. And besides like taking place like in fairy, it is full on just in the regular world, and fairy is like part of the regular world almost. So good, and it takes place in San Francisco, and that like honestly lends itself to it, where it's like they have to glamour themselves. They have to be careful going out like during the daytime, and if they're caught outside like when dawn's like breaks, their glamour removes. And so it's like it's an actual like issue that is brought up in this series, and it's just so good. Okay, I'm getting them all out of the way because the next is Every Heart a Doorway by Sean Maguire, which is the Wayward Children series. This is a series that's basically all these portal fantasies, and these children go and then come back. It's like what happens after they return. And so it is a home for these children who have disappeared for long periods of time and are coming home and are having a hard time adjusting. Their parents send them to this school. Each story kind of focuses on like a different character in a different world, but this one is the home, and our main character was in this very quiet, very still world, and she's back, and then there is a murder. There are murders happening in this. I love this series. Each one is really good. Still, unpopular opinion, the first one is my favorite. I loved it. I love the idea. They could definitely be longer, but they take place in the real world. Well, some of them fully take place in the real world, like this one. Some of them it's like pieces, but a lot of they all at least have some scenes in the real world or Earth, you know, and they're just so good and so unique, and I wish they were longer. For sure, each one could almost be like its own full-length novel, but they're just amazing. The next book and last one by Sean and Maguire is Middle Game. Now this is very unique, and it's almost sci-fi, but it's definitely got a fantasy twist, where this is about twins, Roger and Dodger, who were born and separated at birth, and you learn that their birth was brought about like purposefully, and that is because there's a group of people who believe that a set of twins will bring about like the apocalypse or bring the gods back or something like that. And this was amazing. It is a standalone and it's fantastic. I loved it. It was one of my favorite books of last year, but it takes place on Earth, and so people are limited that way, but it's also got earthly morals and everything, and it was just so good. I loved Roger and Dodger. I hate the names, but it was just amazing, and there are multiple twins, and just like learning how like everything happens. There's this whole mythos almost that Sean and Maguire has created, and it's amazing, and it's like confusing for a while, and then it all comes together, and it's mind-blowing, but just fantastic. Okay, now we're done with Sean and Maguire. Let's get into Rick Riordan, and this is basically all of his series. So Rick Riordan has many young middle grade or older middle grade novels that follow demigods, or in this case, a god in a human body. And I think he does such a great job at like having like the real world be like under threat. And so people are actively trying. I went out of focus there for a second, so hopefully I'm back in focus. But all of these series take place in the real world, but they are demigods and there are gods, and they're trying to like stop apocalypses and people who are coming back to life trying to ruin the world. And it's great. He has Greek, Roman, Egyptian, and Norse mythology under his belt, and a new book just came out that is like a 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea retelling or like sequel or something. Really excited about that. But yeah, each book is, his series are amazing. They are all so good. He's probably most famously known for Percy Jackson, but all of his series are really inventive, and the real world is very important in this, where they're always trying to save the world and trying to keep the fact that they are demigods and that the gods are real from humans, and they're all just great. Okay, the next book I'm going to go into is one of the most popular ones on this list, and that is City of Bones, or basically the first two series by Cassandra Clare. I say that specifically, and that's because I don't like her other two series, but I loved The Mortal Instruments and I loved The Infernal Devices, and they take place in the real world. There are times where they are in a magical city called Idris, but for the most part it takes place on Earth. In Mortal Instruments mostly in New York, and then in the Infernal Devices mostly in London. And they're just so good. So good. And it is about a group of people that are called shadow hunters, who are half angel, half human, and they have to fight against demons. And I mean, if you haven't heard of the series, like, who are you? Where have you been the past like decade and a half? But just so good, honestly. And yeah, take place in the real world. It's very important. Most of the time it's like people trying to kill all humans. So there we go. Okay, and then the next option, I don't think a lot of people see as urban fantasy, and don't get me wrong, it's probably not, but I'm also just kind of seeing like fantasy that takes place in the real world, because I like had the idea to do urban fantasy, and then I realized I don't have like a whole lot of options because I'm not a big urban fantasy reader. So the next one is probably the one that toes the line the most, and that is City of Brass, Kingdom of Copper and Empire of Gold by S.A. Chakraborty. Now the first book, the beginning takes place on Earth, but it is mostly this next two books that two of our main characters are like on Earth, and then they go to the magical world city of Daevabad. And this follows Nari, who thinks she's just a regular human, but when she cons someone into letting her like pretend to do like a exorcism, she accidentally calls forth a deva, or a jinn, who like takes her to Daevabad because he believes that she is the last living descendant of this healer line. And then we also follow a rebel prince, and it's so amazing. Each book gets better and better. They're fantastic. The second and third book, especially the third book, have serious portions of like the story on Earth, and it becomes more of like a real world context where you can see like how the real world would suffer from this. But the trilogy is amazing. The real world portions are actually really interesting because it takes place in Egypt, while I think England and France are like fighting over it, but then they also want their own independence, and so that also like has a storyline, and it's just really interesting. But I love this trilogy. Okay, because I'm picking them all out of a bag, we're now into the hardcovers. But the first series is the Tiger's Curse series by Colleen Houck. Now, a lot of people don't like this series, and I read this at like the perfect time in my life. This is actually the series that really introduced me to mythology. I didn't read Percy Jackson till like late high school, and I don't know, I was interested in mythology, but nothing really like appealed to me. And then this series came along and had to do with Hindu mythology, and it was amazing. I loved the series. I read it as each book came out. I read them like each, I'd get it and then I'd read it in a day, and they were amazing. This follows a girl named Kelsey who signs up to help at a circus for like a summer job, and then she finds out that the tiger that she's been taking care of is actually a cursed Indian prince who needs her help to like break this curse. And I love this series. Now, I've read everything else by Colleen Houck, and I have disliked everything else. So like, if I reread this, would it stand up to time? I hope so. And like, I don't know, she like really found her niche with this, and then everything else just went downhill. But this was just amazing. There is a love triangle, but like it ended the way I wanted it to end, so like it's fine. I've reread The Tiger's Curse so many times. It used to be like my comfort read, where like if I just wanted to like get over a reading slump or just read something that I know I'd love, it was The Tiger's Curse for a long time. And now it's become like Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. But I need to like reread it and just like hope that I love it as much as I did. But like now that I know more about Hindu mythology, it is really interesting, like thinking about like how it was incorporated into this series. But it's great. It takes place on Earth, and it deals with like earthly princes with like happened to be cursed, and it was just fantastic. I loved it. Is it like the best thing ever? No, but for a long time it was like one of my favorites. All right, we're getting down to the last three, and the next one is The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. I mean, there's fantasy in this, right? And it's historical, but it takes place on Earth. This follows Achilles and Patroclus, who Achilles is one of the heroes in the Trojan War. Did it actually happen? Who knows? But it takes place on Earth, and there are fantasy elements where they talk about the gods, and his mom is like a sea witch, sea goddess. Yeah, goddess Thetis. And so like there is a mythological element to it. And there's centaurs. Who am I talking about? There's centaurs in this. Like literally, there's a centaur. So there we go. But I love this book. It's a standalone. It's very short, but the romance is amazing. It broke my heart. I knew how this was gonna end. Like if you know the story of Achilles, like that's how it ends. But it was just so good. And it takes place on Earth. So there we go. All right. And then the last two books are definitely urban fantasies. And so the second to last one is The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern. And you could also say The Night Circus by her also, because this takes place on Earth, but it's about a boy or a man who discovers like a hidden library and finds a book that tells about his life, and it's kind of like the repercussions of that from there. Loved this. A great follow-up to The Night Circus, which also could take place on Earth but with like magic. But honestly, it was so good. It was just like amazing, and Earth is a part of it, and it's definitely an urban fantasy, but also like portal fantasy, but mostly takes place on Earth. And then the last book is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. This follows Addie LaRue, who's alive hundreds of years ago, and her parents want her to be in a arranged marriage, and she makes a deal with basically the devil, where she's like, I want to be free. Well, to the devil, freedom means anonymity. So no one remembers her as soon as she leaves a room. So like if like they're talking great, but as soon as she leaves the room, they forget her. And then finally 300 years later, she runs into someone who remembers her. Amazing. I mean, amazing. I read it this year, loved it. One of the best books of the year for me. Broke my heart, made me sob. So good. But it takes place in the real world, and it's obvious, and it's only in the real world, but there are magical elements. And so it's like, you know, she's in New York, but she's originally from France, and like all this stuff, and we follow her life. Like we get snippets of her life throughout the centuries, and she's in like all these different places and seeing like what they were like back then and everything. Just so good, and definitely urban fantasy. All right, everyone, that is it for my top 10 urban fantasy recommendations. I hope you enjoyed. Let me know in the comments what some of your favorite urban fantasies are, and I will see you soon with another video. Bye.